Hey everyone, so I'm starting off today's video in Disneyland because I was tagged by Valerie from the YouTube channel Art a la Carte to do some art based off of a Disney ride. And she knows this is right up my alley because I love Disney, and we actually went to Disney together in the past. We had VidCon and Disneyland, and it was so fun. And I'm here right now and I'm outside the Haunted Mansion, but not just the Haunted Mansion. It's the Haunted Mansion Holiday. It's been rethemed to be Nightmare Before Christmas, and I haven't seen it before until this trip, and it was just so good. I knew this is what I had to do for my video. So first, let me show you what the ride is like, and then we'll get into the art. So I'm actually showing some sketching alongside the ride footage, otherwise I thought it would just be too boring to have a minute or two of just ride footage. And I have some footage of the exterior of the mansion. Some of it was filmed during the day, and then I also have some from the nighttime just because it looked totally different, and it looks really, really cool at night actually. And then I showed some of the interior of the actual ride. There is a walking portion at the beginning, and then you get into these little carts and you get whisked around the Haunted Mansion and you just look at everything, I guess. It's a dark ride. I didn't show the entire thing, but I did show all of the things that inspired my drawing and the different characters and items I included in mine. So first of all, I'm sketching in Procreate because I knew I would want to move pieces around. There's lots of characters here. I wasn't even sure what I wanted for composition, so I was playing around with that for a bit. But also, when Valerie did her video, she did her art as 3D art, or like 2.5D, whatever you want to call it, where there are layers of 2D art and there are spacers between them that make it pop out and look a little more 3D. I don't think that's a requirement of the challenge, which by the way is called the Disneyland Art Challenge, but I thought it'd be neat to do it the same way she did it because it was super fun and it just is so fitting for this type of art. If you're doing a Disneyland ride, it just looks so good to have the pieces popping out, so I wanted to stick with the same method she used. Now, what's interesting about this ride is it's not just Nightmare Before Christmas. They still keep a lot of the classic Haunted Mansion characters. And so I wanted to include Nightmare Before Christmas characters and Haunted Mansion characters. Otherwise, it's just Nightmare Before Christmas fan art. It's not specific to the ride. And so I made sure to include Madame Leota, which is the lady in the orb, the crystal ball thing. And then I also included the Hatbox Ghost, which was the guy holding a box and his face disappears and then reappears inside the box because he's really cool too. So those are the two Haunted Mansion characters I included. And then for the Nightmare Before Christmas characters, I obviously have to go with Jack in his Santa outfit because that's what he's wearing on the ride. And Oogie Boogie as well. He just looks so cool at the end of the ride, especially how he's glowing. And he had his little Santa hat and beard, which I thought was really cute. Sally's not in this, but she unofficially is because one of the cards that are floating around Madame Leota is of Sally. So technically she's there. She's just really, really tiny. And I had to include Zero with Jack because Zero's just adorable. For background elements, I have a big moon because that's a classic Nightmare Before Christmas look. And I wanted to include some of the spindly trees you see around Halloween Town. It's kind of interesting because this is not Halloween Town, but it's also not Christmas Town. The way I did it, think of it as being, this is the ride. And so I have snow in the sky, but I don't have snow on the ground except for the spiral hill thing. And so it's a little bit weird, but I also didn't want to go too light with the ground and make it snowy because it's a dark ride, and so it's dark, and I wanted the background to be dark, and so I did the black ground that has no snow. I had to include the snowy hill with pumpkins on it because that was just, it was one of the things I love the most in the ride, because the first time you see it, it's just on a screen. It's just a projection of it, and there are snowflakes swirling by, which is why I included the snowflakes in the background. And then later on, you see a physical model of the hill, and it's really cool with the lights on the pumpkins lighting up. It's just really, really neat, and that's one of the things that stood out to me the most on that ride, and so I knew I had to include it somehow. Then I also put 3 tombstones in there to fill up the space and the little duck toy because it's just so cute and I love him. So when I printed off my digital sketch, I had 3 versions of it. There's the full sketch, and then I had a version that was just the characters, and then a version that was just the background, and that way I could easily trace everything. Because when you're doing this type of layered art, it's not like you just draw the drawing once and then cut out the pieces, because there would be holes and gaps and it would look weird. So for example, the hill, there's 2 hills in the background/foreground, and I needed to do those in their entirety, even the areas where the characters get stuck onto it. And so it's kind of like doing the same art almost 2 full times maybe, because you're coloring a lot more than just a standard piece of paper. And so I had to plan it out in such a way that there was overhang. So there's the smaller hill behind the bigger hill, and I had to make sure there was, and I drew down far enough that it could properly overlap. So I would use my light box and my printed out sketches to make sure I was making everything the correct size. I could see, okay, here's where the spiral hill touches the black hill, and I need to make sure the spiral hill goes even farther down than that so they can properly overlap, and that way it looks good if you see it from a different angle. And there I had the paper on top of the Oogie Boogie paper, because I thought, oh, there's a bunch of blank space on the Oogie Boogie page, so I can use that to catch my marker lines that go off the page. I just have to make sure I don't color on Oogie Boogie. And then I didn't pay attention and I colored on Oogie Boogie, but it wasn't too much. It was fixable and I could hide the marks, so that was good. The Hatbox Ghost was pretty fun because he's so dark but has a bit of glow to him. He's mostly black with some bluish highlights, and then he has greenish skin, and so that one was really fun to color. And you can see some of his ribs on the top of his jacket, so that's what those horizontal lines are there. It's not just sudden intense wrinkles. Then I'm coloring in Madame Leota, and she has a different orb thingy than she normally has in the Haunted Mansion. This one is specific to the Haunted Mansion holiday ride, and so that was fun to do. I like the shape of it, and the cards in that room are just so amazing. I love that room in general. There's also that gorgeous big, not a chandelier, it just looks like a giant candelabra, a big candle thing. And it's so pretty. I just love that room. It's cards and the lights. There's orbs also around Madame Leota. I didn't include those because I figured the cards were enough, but very, very gorgeous. The one room I did not tackle is that really wide room with the dancing ghosts and the table and the big tree and the fireplace. That's a lot. That's a nice, beautiful room. I love it, but it just didn't really translate as well into this. I don't know. I made a list of everything I wanted to include, and none of that stuff made it onto the list. There were just too many other things that were more recognizable and would fit into a scene jam-packed with characters and props. One thing I did not do was do multiple layers on one individual character, except Zero, where I separated the head from the body. So I could have done more layers, but I think it would just be too much. One, and just too much work because this is already a lot of work, but also consider the side where Jack is. I know you don't really see a whole lot of it right now, but I had written out what was going to go on what layer. And on Jack's side, there's already a lot building up because there was the background, and there was the swirly hill and the pumpkins, then there's the black hill in front of it, and then there's a little tombstone, and then there's Jack's sack, and then Jack, and then the duck, and then the tombstone. It was just a lot of layers. I was like, okay, Jack needs to be like one layer. He's technically two, I guess, because his sack is a layer behind him. It feels really weird saying his sack. Jack's sack. So he's technically 2 layers as well, I guess. And then Oogie Boogie is just one, and everyone else is just one. I also made sure to keep the shading on the characters fairly bright, so I would shade the greens with green, and for Jack I'd shade his reds with red, and for the yellow duck I'd shade the yellows with yellow. That way it was just brighter, because when you're in the ride, the whole background is black, and then you have these neon items glowing in a black light, and it just pops, right? It just pops off the background. And so I wanted to somewhat convey that by keeping the characters nice and bright on the dark background. Although, of course, the Hatbox Ghost is not bright. So then it was time to cut everything out, which was a little tedious, especially for things like the little tree sticks and the pumpkins. Oh, the pumpkins, those are really tiny. Then I realized, hey, there's no room on my desk. Let me clean up all these Copic markers before I actually start cutting all this out. And some parts I cut with an X-Acto knife, but I did find it quickest to just use scissors for most of it. I know there's gonna be at least one comment being like, why didn't you use your Cricut? And that's because cutting it with scissors is faster than creating a cut file. It's not like the Cricut just knows where to cut. You have to create a file that tells it where to cut. And so I did not want to even attempt that. And what if it cut on the art? No. Oh, this is an accident waiting to happen. I just thought, okay, cut with my scissors. When I inked the characters, I made sure to have a really thick outline around them so that I could cleanly cut them, because I didn't want to have any white bits showing, but I also didn't want to cut off all the black outline, so I made it thick enough that I could cut right down the middle of the black line. So speaking of rides, what is your favorite Disney ride if you've ever been to any of the Disney parks? My number one was California Scream, and now I just gotta say it's Guardians of the Galaxy. It's the reskinned / redone Tower of Terror. So it's still a drop ride like Tower of Terror, but it's so good, so fun. The music is great. It's just amazing. So yeah, Guardians is my favorite. It's also the most thrilling ride at Disneyland, and I like thrill rides, so yeah. And then the Incredicoaster, which is the rebranding of the California Screamin' Coaster. That is my second fave. And then my third fave is Grizzly River Run, which is a rafting ride. And all three of those are at California Adventure, which is funny. They're all at the same park. I mean, I've only ever been to Disneyland and to Disney World. I haven't been to like the Paris one or the Tokyo one, Shanghai, Hong Kong, whatever. I haven't been to the other ones. I'd love to go to some of them someday, but so far it's just Disneyland and Disney World, which is still a lot. Just Disneyland and just Disney World, like, oh. So yeah, let me know what your favorite rides are. I think my favorite dark rides are one, Haunted Mansion Holiday, which I only experienced for the first time this year. And then I also love the Winnie the Pooh dark ride. It's just so good. It's so nice. Especially the one in Disneyland. I just feel like it's so good. I guess Space Mountain is right up there too. That's technically a dark ride. Although usually when I think dark ride, I think of a slow-moving dark ride. So now it's time to stick all the pieces together. I'm using my craft foam, which was fairly thin actually, and so I had to glue 2 layers of foam together to stick on the back of any given object. And the only time I would use a single layer of foam is if I was sticking an object onto a piece of itself, like for example Zero's head onto Zero's body. I would use just one piece, otherwise the head would stick out too much. But for everything else it was doubled up. But when you have a gap, you have to start stacking even more. So if, for example, the hill I just put on the background, both of those hills, there's 2 layers of foam behind them. But if there's any object that overhangs that, it needs 4 pieces of foam. So for example, this big hill in the foreground, it had 2 layers of foam where it overlapped with the other hill pieces, but where it was just directly on the background, it needed 4 pieces so that it would be the same height all over. The pumpkins on the Swirly Hill are an example of where I just did 1 layer, and there are actually 2 pumpkins that are directly glued onto the hill because one was so tiny, and then there was another one that I found later and glued on because it was still in the box, and that one I just glued directly on as well. The Hatbox Ghost is another example of him having 2 layers on his lower body, but then he had, I think, 6 underneath his head. I just used a regular glue stick with this, which made it nice for being able to move things around easily, but it was a little tricky when you had really teeny pieces of foam and you're stacking it 6 pieces high and they're all slipping everywhere. It was a little bit of a struggle, but still pretty okay. Honestly, gluing it all together is the funnest part because you finally get to see it all come together as a final result. It's different than a regular piece of art where you see it coming together start to finish. This is more like a bunch of separate pieces that get puzzled together at the end. Oh yeah, note about Jack's legs. The one's cut off because I was like, well, you're not gonna see this anyway. The other one, I knew you would see a part of it, but that the tombstone in the foreground would cover where the black part of his leg, which is his boot, meets the red part. And there's actually a white fluffy section there at the top of his boots because it's the Santa Claus outfit. But I thought, oh, that's going to be covered by the tombstone, so I'm not even going to draw that in. But there was actually a pretty big gap, so I totally should have drawn it in. I did scribble on a little white area with a gel pen, but it didn't stick out off of his leg. Like his leg was still just a straight stick, so it's not quite right. But you don't really see it unless you really look to the side, and so it worked out. And then Oogie Boogie's so weird because he sticks out so much so that he's in front of Jack, but there aren't many other layers really close to him, and so he's just popping way off. But he needs to be that far forward because he is the character closest to the foreground. One thing I did end up changing is that if you look at the Hatbox Ghost where he's positioned relative to the sky, a lot of the snowflakes are covered by him, and then there's just a blank piece of sky with no snowflakes on either side of him. And so I did go in at the very end, you'll see it in the last shot, I did add a few extra snowflakes just so it wouldn't look so empty in that part of the sky. And of course I had to include several angles because it's just so cool. Ugh. I love how if you look at it from the front and just turn it a little bit in a circle, it almost is a 3D effect. It's just really neat, just gives a little bit of parallax to everything. I like it, it's very cool. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you Valerie for tagging me in this. This was super fun. You guys definitely should try the Disneyland Art Challenge. It doesn't have to just be Disneyland. I'm sure it can be any Disney ride you want. But yeah, thank you, and I will see you in my next video.